Thank you everyone for coming to another one of our digital seminar series on consumer search. Now, Cole Williams will present his paper, Influencing Search.
All right, thank you. Thank you everybody for coming. So today I'm going to be presenting Influencing Search. It's joint work with Martin. And our current status with the paper is it's a work in progress. And so any comments that you have on how we can improve the paper would be greatly appreciated. All right, so the topic that we're going to be talking about today is social media influencers. So influencers are people who produce online content. So they post pictures on Instagram, they stream on Twitch, or they upload videos on YouTube. And they use their platform to recommend products to their followers. So there are going to be many different types of influencers, and they focus on specific areas of the market. So there are influencers who focus on cosmetics. So they post pictures of themselves trying out new types of makeup and recommending them to their followers. And then there's others that show different ways of cooking food. There are fitness influencers, fashion, lifestyle, or even gaming influencers. So these influencers, the influencer marketing is a booming industry right now, with estimates in 2018 estimating that the size of the market is between 5 and 10 billion US dollars. So these influencers, they give the recommendations, but they're not free recommendations. Each individual influencer can earn thousands of dollars for a post and up to $1 million for each individual post. So this is a serious market. And this one might come as a surprise to many of you who are less familiar with influencers. So let me introduce you to a few of these characters who are influencers. So here's one example of an influencer on Instagram. Her name's Janae Daly. And you see that she has 145,000 followers. So that's a substantial follower base. She would be considered a macro influencer. And yeah, so she calls herself a lifestyle influencer. And her main niche is in interior design. So here you see her advertising that she went to Hunker Home and purchased some potted plants for decorating her house. Another example of an influencer is Jesse Driftwood. So he is a photographer from Canada. And in this post, he is talking about how he's hooked on a new Canon 1DX Mark II camera. And finally, a much more niche influencer is Tony Justice, who is an American truck driver. And here he is advertising for bull snot tire butter for keeping your tires on your pickup truck shiny. So as you can see, there are many different types of influencers in any market that you can imagine. There's going to be some influencer. So this presents a few questions then. How exactly do influencers affect the consumer decisions? After all, the influencers are just either taking pictures of themselves enjoying the use of a product or just providing a recommendation. And in particular, why would a consumer follow the recommendation even if they know that the influencer is getting paid for the recommendation, and in some cases handsomely? And finally, how do influencers affect market outcomes? Do they introduce distortions to the market? And should competition authorities worry about how influencers are affecting the market? And so the way we're going to approach these questions is through the lens of consumer search. And the reason why we think this is the right way to think about influencers is because people, they follow influencers because their preferences are correlated. But when they inspect a good, a consumer may very well disagree with the recommendation of an influencer and choose not to buy. So in this way, we think of the influencer as directing the individuals with their recommendation. So so when the consumer, they go to a post, the recommendation influences how the order in which consumers visit firms. So that's how we're thinking about it. So I know this is going to be a fresh topic for many people. Any questions about the general topic of influencers before I go on?
Just a quick thought that if you show me these celebrity influencers, maybe the first thing that comes to mind is an analog with celebrity advertising. So, you know, there's, okay. So there's a search sort of angle, which is what you're doing. And I guess there's maybe an advertising angle if I was thinking about how this might work. So there may be like a signaling, you know, money burning sort of story behind it from the advertising perspective, and or again, emulation of types you want to be like.
Right.
Yeah,
So
that was just my first reaction.
well, right. That's the first reaction. Yeah, exactly. And the way we see it though is that there are some of these influencers are not necessarily celebrities. So these individuals I showed you, they are either macro influencers or they can even be micro influencers, and they still have an effect. And so we think that there's actually a more interesting reason why they would direct search other than just having the money burning signaling story of advertising. So we think that there's something more to the picture than that. But yeah, that's a good point.
So also kind of along those lines, a lot of these influencers are also experts. So how should we be thinking of that beyond just the correlated aspect?
Right. So they are, yeah, so they are experts. So they might have extra knowledge about what exactly the consumer would want. So the Janae, the interior designer character, she would know better than the average consumer, for example, what would be the right place to go to for these products. And so you can have both elements. You can have the consumer just be more knowledgeable than the ordinary consumer about what they would personally like, right? Because people, they follow particular influencers based off of their brand, what types of recommendations they give. But we'd expect there to be some expectation that the recommendations the influencer gives is going to be correlated with their preferences.
Does an influencer lower search costs? Almost all influencers provide links to the product they're using.
Right. So that's a good point. That is a feature you could introduce into the model, but we're going to find that that's not, because we're going to have homogeneous search costs for all the consumers. That wouldn't actually affect our outcomes. You'll see after I introduce the model why that wouldn't affect the model, the predictions of the model. That's a good point, though. All right. Any more questions? Okay. So let me give you an idea of what we're going to do and what we're going to find. So what we're going to do is we're going to build on a standard Volinsky model. And we're going to introduce two features. One, there's going to be another agent who's the influencer. And the influencer is going to have correlated preferences with those of the consumers. And in particular, we're going to assume that their match values with firms is affiliated. All right. And so then what we're going to do in the model, in the baseline model, is we're going to have the influencer first sample some number of sellers, learn his match value with each of the sellers, and then just report honestly what his with which seller he has the highest match value with. Okay, so you can take this to be the baseline setting is just where the influencer gives an honest recommendation of which from the sampled products he likes best. And what we're going to find is that the recommended firm is going to charge a higher price as a result of the recommendation. And the followers are going to start their search at the recommended firm. And as a result, welfare is going to be increased with the presence of the influencer.
Cole, can I ask you a question?
Oh, please.
Why wouldn't the influencer consider price when making the recommendation?
Right. So I think that would be an interesting point, and that would simplify. So, okay. So let me tell you. So the way we have the model set up right now, the firms, they can set the price after observing the recommendation. Right.
That's right. So therefore, of course, they.
Right. And also, actually, I think a better answer to that is we're setting up the model because we want to actually look at the case when the influencers are going to be paid for the recommendations. All right. And so ultimately, we're going to care about the case where the influencers only care about how much they make. So they're not going to be just thinking about the prices. All right.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so yeah, so this is the baseline setting, the best setting where the influencer is perfectly honest. So then we add a tweak to the model. We say, okay, what if instead the influencer, when he samples the different firms, each firm can also offer a contract now, and all the to recommend their product, and the influencer only cares about maximizing his expected income. We're going to find that this actually does not affect the results. So firms are going to compete to be recommended and offer contract with positive commissions for each unit sold. And in a symmetric equilibrium, the influencer is going to recommend the firm that he expects to generate the highest expected sales. And so then as consumers continue to search, if they are disappointed, so the influencer, when he examines the products, he knows that if a consumer goes to a firm, visits a firm, he will continue if his match value is insufficiently high. The optimal recommendation for the influencer is to just recommend the product that he likes the best himself. All right. So, in fact, even if the influencer is paid for the recommendation, in this case, he does best by still providing honest recommendations. All right, so the next step in our analysis is we're going to say, okay, well, here we benefited from the fact that the influencer was able to just sample for free some number of products and then recommend them. Let us now endogenize this, because the influencer would still need to apply some effort to determine his own match value with products. So here we found that, so for step 2, there was an incentive to provide honest recommendations, but here we also find that the influencer has an incentive to provide informed recommendations as well. So now if we endogenize the influencer search problem, this will create a similar result. In particular, for small enough search costs, the influencer is going to have an incentive to give an informed recommendations. So he will sequentially search different firms, and each firm will offer a contract. And in equilibrium, he will only recommend a product if he himself has a sufficiently high match value with the product. All right. So that's just a general overview of our results. Let me now tell you how this compares to the literature. So the closest literature that we have in mind to the idea of when we're considering the commissions is the literature on intermediaries in the financial and health markets. So in these markets, when there's doctors prescribing different medications, or financial advisors providing recommendations for investments, we often think of these as being credence goods, so that the consumers themselves cannot assess the value of the product. They just have to take the advisor's recommendation at face value. So they completely rely on the information that's provided by the intermediary. And the questions that are asked in this literature, or to what extent the advice is biased, if biased firms pay advisors in the form of kickbacks, and should advisors be forced to disclose their financial relations? And in particular, in this literature, it's important that there is some type of explicit cost to providing a bad recommendation to have any equilibrium with information transmission. But our results are different. And so we see that a search market is importantly different from these markets with credence goods, because a consumer can voluntarily follow the influencer because what they recommend is correlated with their own preferences. But the consumers, if it's a bad recommendation, they'll continue to search, right? So they don't have to just rely on the recommendation itself. So we find that in search markets, advice is itself disciplined by the desire to have the commission without having to require some additional cost for providing bad recommendations. So our model itself, it builds, like I said before, it builds on Volinsky. In our baseline model.
Before we move on, can I ask you about models where the influencer is some kind of search engine or something like that? Would that fit your model?
So were the influencers just
So,
use
so,
search
yeah,
engine?
I mean, from what I understand, you will have a situation where interested firms will influence the order of search or the order of recommendation by the influencer. Is that very different from firms bidding for position in a position auction so that
Right.
they're searched earlier?
Right. No, so the way we're thinking about it is the influencer is going to be affecting the search order, right?
Right.
Uh,
Okay, so a search engine will be influencing a search order. Search engine knows something, right? Because it has an algorithm that somehow figures out what is likely to be a good product for the consumer. Like Amazon has a search engine that does that. But then firms can bid to appear at the top, so kind of break the honest recommendation.
right. I'd have to think about that exactly. Let me think.
I mean, this is not a criticism. It's more like, can you have another interpretation for your model?
Right. Yeah. That's a good point. I'll put some more thought into that. I think one important feature here, though, is that the influencer would have okay, so that the consumer would expect the influencer to have special knowledge about their own preferences due to the correlation in their preferences. Whereas in a search engine, they can provide, yeah, okay, so maybe the difference is in horizontal differentiation versus vertical differentiation. Maybe the search engine would provide the highest quality products or something like that, whereas the influencer would be able to indicate which products are the best for the particular consumer. But I'll put more thought into that question. That's a good point. Thank you.
I have a related question too.
Sure.
Can you consider the influencers, when the influencers are honest, can you consider them as an experiment in the Bayesian persuasion game?
We don't have, our recommendations are very simple. So the influencer just indicates, just recommends a product. So it's not that there's some information structure that they're selecting. It's going to be very simple here. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
A follow-up, actually, on the stuff you have on the slide. If an influencer is using a product and giving some correlated value based on that, you're assuming that all of this is revealed after a search cost is paid, versus a lot of this would likely be revealed once somebody purchases it and it's delivered. Even if you could return it, that means there's almost extra sunk cost here. Right, like I'm thinking a video game or something like that, they're normally showing you an experience more than you would be able to see else without that.
So wait, okay, let me just see if I understand. So is this related to your decreasing the search cost question, or is this different?
This is more if an influencer gives you some sort of advice, you know exactly what that advice meant for you by paying your search cost. There's nothing that's left to be learned, for example, once somebody purchases the product.
Right, exactly. So we're thinking this like the typical Valinsky model, to where after you pay your search cost, you learn your match value with the product, right? So you don't then have to additionally purchase the product to learn your match value.
But I buy that in a pure search problem, because what you believe prior to your purchase is basically your effective value when you're making your selection. But from this perspective, where almost all influencers are showing you more about the product than you could see on the product's page, I would just worry that there would also be some sort of change in value that might not even be real, but would not be revealed prior to making the purchase.
Right. So I guess the type of product we're thinking about is something like some controller, for example. A gamer says, "Oh, I recommend this controller." Then he plays with the controller, shows that he's doing very well. Then the consumer could go to the store and play around with it. However you imagine search in typical search models, that's going to be present here. But yeah, I guess I'll put some more thought into that question as well. Any more questions? All right, so I So with this, okay, so yeah, we're building on Volinsky. Let me move on to further literature that we're going to compare to. So there is some work that discusses influencers, some recent work, but they think about influencers a little bit differently. So they think about influencers within the context of network externalities, where the consumption of one consumer directly affects the utility of another individual to consume that same product. So in that framework, they're thinking of just more or less influential members within a society, whereas our focus is on professional influencers who are paid for actual recommendations and how they affect search. So our questions are different in that respect. So relative to the literature in consumer search, the closest literature is that on how the search order affects firms' pricing strategies. So we have the work in prominence, order search, and then advertising. And so in contrast to our paper, in this literature, the firm that is searched first charges lower prices. And in particular, when there are a finite number of firms, the more prominent firms, they faced more inelastic demand. And so they are pressured to charge a lower price. Whereas in our paper, the reason the consumers first search the recommended firm is that they expect to have a better match value. And so there's going to be a higher price. There's related work with service provision in search, where the first firm that is searched is expected to provide a service. And so they'll also charge a higher price, but that's through a different channel. So that's because it's going to be related to the cost of actually providing the service. And there's also work on endogenous effects on the order of search through observational learning, where consumers' valuations are also correlated and consumers observe the purchase of a single predecessor. But the important difference is that in our paper, there's going to be one individual, the influencer, whose actions affect the search and pricing of this action. And this action is unaffected by the prices themselves. Okay, so any more questions before I dive into the baseline model? All right, let's jump in. So like I said, we're just building on a standard Volinsky model. So here we're going to have a Volinsky model where, in particular, we're going to assume there are a large number of firms, where we normalize it to just be a unit mass. There are L consumers, each with unit demand, and an influencer. The match values are going to be assumed to be strictly affiliated with a log concave joint density, and a consumer can pay a search cost to learn the price and match value of a good before making a purchase. Okay, so let me give you the timing of our game. So we developed the timing of the game in keeping in mind that our main goal is to introduce a contracting stage into the game. So nature is going to first determine the value for all agents. Then the influencer is going to randomly sample some fixed number of firms and is going to select the one with the highest match value to be recommended. The firms are then going to observe the influencer's selection and set their prices. And we're going to assume that the recommended firm can choose whether the influencer also discloses the price that he charges. The influencer then issues the recommendation to the consumers, who then begin their search. And then the model proceeds in the typical way that it would for a Volinsky model. So any questions about the timing of the game? I want to make sure that we're all on the same page.
Sorry, I don't want to sound like annoying, but it seems like this influencer, at least in this, when you're describing the baseline, the timing of the game, they act like an experiment. So you have a very simple kind of a signal structure. So the signal structure says which one of the sample firms that has the highest match value. I mean, it doesn't have to, but it seems like that.
Well, I mean, formally it is an experiment, right? So that's what it turns into. But you're right, it is a particular type.
Yeah.
I think when it becomes more interesting is when we have the contracting stage, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. That's a good point.
Can I ask a question? So
Yes.
So what is the second part of the step 3? So why we are thinking about whether the the firm chooses whether the influencer disclose his price. I thought that this is Walensky. I mean, then it's hidden, right? The price is. So I mean, can you explain why you have this assumption about the.
Right. So this is just going to be more of a technical assumption to you'll see as we go along why this assumption comes into place. It's not going to affect. Let's see. I think, how do I respond to this? It's not going to have a strong effect on the outcomes of the models. It's just going to avoid certain outcomes that aren't interesting. Okay. And legally, because we do have in mind that there is going to be a contracting stage. So here the contracts could include where the firm asks the influencer to disclose the price, and then it would be illegal then to change the price. So realistically, so if we're just trying to think, okay, what would be more realistic? It would be more realistic to at least give the firm the option of disclosing the price at this stage. But you'll see exactly where this comes into play as we go along. It's not going to be the most important assumption. All right. Okay, so we're going to be looking. So our solution concept is perfect Bayesian equilibria, where the consumers treat non-recommended firms symmetrically. So they have the same expectations about their prices, and they search them randomly. So they don't privilege one or the other. We're also going to assume that consumers hold passive beliefs. Okay, so a few remarks. So all results will continue to hold if we assume that, if we take the affiliation to the extreme, where we assume that match values are in fact identical between the influencer and the consumers. We could also have some consumers not observe the recommendation of the influencer, so we could increase the size of the market in that way. We could also just have there being multiple influencers with non-overlapping follower bases. Okay, so let's go into solving the model then.
Can I ask one more question?
Oh, please.
So you assume that there is a continuum of firms, right? So infinitely many firms.
Yes.
So is that I mean the reason why you don't want to have a finite number of firms is because you don't want to have this the primus effect. Like if there's a finite number of firms, then the first firm actually has an incentive to lower the price.
Right. So that's not the main reason that we're making the assumption, though. But you're right. So two answers to that. One is it does isolate our particular effect and doesn't contaminate it with the prominence effect. But it also makes it so that we can actually solve the model, because if you have a finite number of firms, then if one firm is recommended, then you'll be able to then if a consumer follows the recommendation, inspects that firm, there's going to be correlated values now. You see your match value with the one firm, and then you can make inferences about your other match values. So that makes the model much more complicated.
So in a way, so the simple Weizmann rule is not going to apply.
Yeah, in the finite case. So here we're able to isolate our particular effect. But you're right, it also doesn't contaminate it with the prominence effect. That's exactly right.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so solving the model now. So suppose now that the influencer, we're going to look at the consumer's problem. So suppose the influencer has recommended one of the firms. So then consumers are going to revise their beliefs. Let's let G, conditional on R, denote the posterior for the match value distribution for the recommended firm. And for non-recommended firms, the posterior is going to remain the prior. So that's the exact question that was just asked now. So because you have infinitely many firms, you don't know what other firms were being compared by the influencer, you don't draw any inferences about firms that were not recommended. So in this case,
sorry, may I ask a couple of questions? So
sure.
You keep this posterior equal to prior because you have infinite number of firms.
Yes, exactly.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you model this infinite number? Because, well, we had this question, I think, a week ago, but with our case, each consumer was working only with countably many firms, and here say there's continuum of firms.
Yeah.
So how would the influencer, so how should I think about continuum of match values from which the influencer is going to choose?
Okay. So that's a great question.
Tricky object to think about.
So let me clarify. So the influencer, they draw from a uniform distribution over these firms, they select just a finite number here. They just select K here. So yeah, it's not going to be that complicated mathematical object that you're thinking about. It's just they randomly select K.
So the influencer selects from a finite number.
Yes,
Sorry.
exactly. So this is a simple way that we're going to model the information acquisition. And at the end, we're going to then endogenize this information acquisition piece right here.
And also
Okay,
here, okay, no, please.
Oh, sorry, Teddy, please go ahead. Yes.
No, you go ahead. I thought that you're
No, I just wanted to clarify just one more thing. So then the consumers, they will not know from which firms the influencer was choosing.
Right. I should be clear about that.
Yes.
They just know
Perfect, yeah,
that
thanks.
I recommend one of them. Yes.
Good, thank you. Yeah. So Teddy, please go ahead.
Oh, sorry. So here you are assuming that you are recommending only the product. You don't say, what's your match value.
Exactly. It's just a simple recommendation because we're thinking
otherwise
that
things can get too complicated, right? Because the inference problem is going to be much more complicated.
Right. So if you learn their match value, then you could still work with that if you just learned if they just report their individual match value. But working with just the raw recommendation, it does simplify matters. Yeah.
May I ask one question? Does it matter if K is known to consumers?
Oh, yes, that's a good question. So
because it's quite different if you have sampled 100 firms and say this is the best out of 100 or this is the best out of 2.
It's going to make a difference what their expectations are. So here we're assuming that they know, I should be clear about that. We're assuming that they know K, but they could still actually just hold a prior over K, right? So you could have some like a inverse geometric or something, some prior over what number K is going to be. And then everything would still go through. They just need to know that there's something informative actually about the recommendation. That's really all that matters. Good. Really good questions. Okay, so in this case, because there are infinitely many firms, Pandora's rule is still going to be optimal. So let's dig into this. So, okay, so the first important point though is that following a recommendation, the posterior for the recommended firm for any individual consumer's match value is going to have a likelihood ratio dominance over the prior. So this is a very strong form of dominance, and it's driven by the fact that their match values are affiliated. And in particular, this is going to imply that the posterior dominates the prior in the first order stochastic dominance, okay? So that's solved for the reservation prices for both the recommended firm and then the non-recommended firm. These are going to be the values, the unique values that solve these two equations. This will be all familiar. And because of the first order stochastic dominance, we see that the reservation price for the recommended firm is going to be strictly larger than the reservation price for the non-recommended firms. All right. So then given these reservation prices, what prices are going to be charged then by the different firms? So let's let P sub R be the price charged by the recommended firm and P be the equilibrium price charged by the non-recommended firm. So for a non-recommended firm, upon being visited and charging a price P tilde, he's going to make a sale only if the value for a given consumer exceeds the larger of the two, either the reservation value for the non-recommended firms, the other non-recommended firms, or the recommended firm. But of course, because the non-recommended firm is being visited, he knows it cannot be that in a symmetric equilibrium, it cannot be that the reservation value for the recommended firm is strictly larger than the reservation value of the non-recommended firms, and it still be that the consumer hasn't visited the recommended firm yet. So all this is to say is that for a non-recommended firm, all he needs to consider is the reservation values for other non-recommended firms when setting his price. So we can write the objective function for the non-recommended firm in the usual way. And this will find the familiar solution of the inverse of the hazard rate. So any questions about that? No? Okay. So then now let's look at the problem for the recommended firm. So when they're visited, they are going to face a different objective function because they now know that their product is liked more by the consumer base. So they also have the revised the distribution. So if we're looking for the solution to this one, we are going to find a similar expression. But here's where that one assumption comes in. We also can identify the highest price at which the consumers would still be willing to follow the recommendation. So we know that if the price is too high for the recommended firm, then even though the reservation price is higher for the recommended firm, the reservation value would be higher for the non-recommended firm, and consumers would not want to follow the recommendation. So the optimal price for the firm is going to charge whichever is the lower of these two, either the interior optimal price or the boundary solution at which if they raise the price by any amount, no consumer would follow the recommendation. And in particular, if this interior value exceeds the boundary, then they would strictly prefer to disclose the price. Otherwise, they don't have a preference about that. Okay, so just aggregating the prices that we found so far. We have the price of the non-recommended firms, and then the interior and the boundary price for the recommended firm. But if we notice that the likelihood ratio implies hazard rate dominance. So if we recall that, we can see that it must be that the recommended firm charges a higher price than the non-recommended firms. So firstly, on the boundary, it's clear that P R double prime must be strictly larger than P, because this first expression, the difference between the reservation prices, is strictly positive. Okay, so if we're on the boundary, we know that the recommended firm is charging a strictly higher price. Even for an interior price, it must be true. So if we were to set PR prime to be equal to P, okay, so if they were to charge the same price, then what we'd have is just the argument would just be R for both the CDF and the PDF, right? But because of hazard rate dominance, that would mean that the right side is strictly larger than the left side here. So we know for sure that they can't be charging the same price. And if you work it out, you can see that they must be charging a strictly higher price too, even if it's an interior price. So putting these thoughts together, we arrive at our first proposition, which is just in equilibrium, the consumers are going to begin their search at the recommended firm, while this firm is going to charge a higher price than the firms that are not recommended. In addition, we can see that the presence of the influencer is going to increase welfare and industry profits. And so consumer surplus itself is going to be strictly higher as long as the price charged is strictly interior as well. Okay, so any questions at this point? I want to make sure that we're on the same page.
Yeah, can you explain again where this likelihood ratio dominance is coming from? Because I understand that there is this conditional distribution of match utilities, right? Which first order stochastically dominates the standard one given the recommendation. But why you have the likelihood ratio property here kicking in is from some assumption.
The affiliation.
The affiliation assumption.
Yeah, because we've assumed that the match values are strictly affiliated between the influencer and the consumers. So the affiliation provides the likelihood ratio dominance following a recommendation, which that further then implies first order stochastic dominance and then hazard rate dominance.
Likelihood ratio dominance.
Right, exactly. So that's this.
Yes.
We get that, and that implies the two other types of dominance.
Exactly, because you had only FOSD. That doesn't imply
right.
Hazard ratio dominant. Yeah, right.
Exactly right. Exactly.
So you need this more primitive. Okay.
Exactly right. Great question. Any other questions? Okay. So just to illustrate, I'm going to look at the extreme case. So when I'm trying to examine the changes in the sample size. I've found it very difficult to do with any distributions where the match values are affiliated. So it's easier to do if I look at the extreme where the match values are the same, right? Like I said before, all the results still go through in this case. So here's one example here where the match values are uniformly distributed 0, 1. They're identical, and I'm going to set the search cost to be equal to 1/8. So here we see that if we increase the sample size of the influencer, that's going to increase the price that is charged by the recommended firm. Okay, so you have these two effects here where it's going to increase the expected match value. So following a recommendation is going to increase the match value for the consumer, right? So it makes the information more valuable, but at the same time, it increases the price. So if you put these together, you could have non-monotonicities in the consumer surplus. So where if you increase the quality of the information, initially the consumer surplus is increasing from higher quality information, but because firms can also capitalize on this information, that could also drop as well. Okay. But still the main takeaway from this section though is that the introduction of influencers increases total welfare, strictly increases industry profits, and if we were to dig into it, as long as the demand facing the recommended firm doesn't become too inelastic, it'll also strictly increase the welfare for consumers. So another way to say that is just as long as there's a strictly interior price, then consumers are strictly better off. So that's the summary of this subsection. But all of these results relied on the fact that our influencer was providing honest recommendations. But in reality, as we mentioned before, recommendations don't come for free. Influencers are paid very well for these recommendations. And the way it works in practice is that payments often include both fixed components, but then also commissions. And the way this works is influencers have their own referral links, as was mentioned before by Dan. And so they have these links, and the firms, they can track which customers are being driven to make a purchase by the particular influencer. And there's actual software that automatically tracks these successful referrals and provides commissions to influencers. So they have the software in place that does this automatically. And another way to keep track of successful referrals by an influencer is through individualized promotional discount codes. So they provide a promo code to a particular influencer, and when a customer then goes to make a purchase, they'll use that code, and you can see who had directed them to your company. All right, so motivated by these facts about contracts, we're going to modify the model so that when the influencer is still going to sample some fixed number of firms, but now each firm is going to offer a contract to have their product recommended. We're going to say that the contracts are comprised of a lump sum component and some commission schedule describing how much the influencer is paid for each additional sale that is translated. And we're going to assume that the influencer is just risk neutral and only cares about maximizing his expected payment. So to be clear about the timing of the model now, we're still going to have nature determine the match values, but now the influencer is going to sample some firms who are then going to offer the contract. The influencer is going to observe the contracts and his match values and then selects one to be recommended. So he agrees to a contract. The firms observe whether or not their contract was accepted by the influencer. They're going to set their prices. Then, as before, the recommended firm can choose whether or not to have the influencer disclose his price. And the influencer is going to then issue the recommendation to the consumers who then begin their search. All right.
So may I ask a question about
Please.
timing? So
Yes,
it looks to me a little bit awkward that the influencer has to sample firms, and only then they offer contracts. Would that kind of change if all the firms come up with their contracts first, and then the influencer just randomly selects firms he would consider and makes a contract with those firms. Well, one of those firms.
So you're asking, what if the firms all
I'm saying, like,
approach the influencer first?
Yes, all firms, they have their contracts on offer, but the influencer understands that I can only look, well, K contracts, well, K products, and therefore I will finally make a contract with one of those K firms.
Right.
Would that make a difference
No,
for your solution?
Right. So, okay. So just to make sure we're on the same page. So if the firms all individually set them contracts, and then the influencer says, okay, I only have limited attention, I can only examine K of these, and then they select those ones that they'll examine, that's fine as well.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Good question. Good question. Actually, I think I should probably set up the timing in that way. That seems more natural. Thanks. Okay, so this is the timing, and here's what we find, that in an equilibrium where consumers follow the recommendation, and if firms offer identical contracts with a positive commission, then the influencer is going to recommend the seller that he has the highest match value with. And so let me unpack the intuition for why this works. So firstly, with identical contracts, the influencer is going to want to recommend the product that is most likely to sell. Right? So he's presented these contracts, he examines the different products. Because he wants to maximize his own income, he just cares about which product is most likely to sell to his consumer base. Right? But because the match values are affiliated, so he knows that his consumer base has affiliated match values with himself, the influencer is actually going to do best to then give an honest recommendation, then to recommend the one that he personally likes the best from these. And the consumers then, knowing this, do best to follow the recommendation. Okay, so we see that with identical contracts, that the results do not change. And even if you allowed some type of mixed strategies or asymmetries, the results won't be exactly that they'll give honest recommendations, but they'll still give informative recommendations. So it's not going to be very sensitive to that particular assumption, right? So, so any questions about this result?
And you said that this result is different from Inderes and Ottaviani, and the reason is that they do not model this inspection, right? So if people receive a recommendation, they cannot inspect, they just buy it.
Exactly.
And here you can give the buyer's recommendation, but people still inspect the product and they say, oh, this is wrong.
Exactly.
And that's the main reason, I see.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's what we think is important, is that if you have any ability then for the customer to on their own inspect the product, which that's what we think of when we think of search markets and the way influencers are directing them, then there's this discipline that's getting placed on them, because the customer can also decide just not to make the purchase if their match value isn't high enough. That's the main difference between that.
Right. And actually in those kind of markets, regulation has been towards forbidding this kind of kickbacks or these kind of commissions for these intermediaries or experts, right? While here you would not need this kind of regulation.
Exactly. That's, you took the punchline of the paper away. That's exactly it. That's exactly right. That's how we're thinking about that, is that when we think about what policy should be set, we really need to think about how do those who are being advised respond to the advice. Is it just directing them to their first search, or is it that that's it, they have to follow the advice and they don't really know what else to do following that? They just either accept it or they don't.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Can I just add to that? So my understanding of Inderes and Ottaviani was that in that paper, well, I mean, there's a whole bunch of papers.
Yeah, the whole bunch of
guess,
papers,
but in the AER one, the sort of striking result was, they're still recommending the right thing, because the right product is the one that has the lowest marginal cost and so has most to bribe you with to get you to recommend it. But that's socially efficient. So they had this result in some sense that these intermediaries are making the right recommendations, and that these policies that so, you know, like disclosure policies and things like that it wasn't so obvious that what they did for welfare.
Okay, so I think one point I'd like to make though is that in those models, they still need to have some type of cost for providing a bad recommendation. And there are a number of different interpretations to it. So it could be that you intrinsically care about providing a bad match, or that you have some reputational effect. You have something like that. So I think that's the main point that I'm trying to tease out here, is that you're right, they have that interesting result. And we're saying that if you additionally have a search, and you're in more of a search framework, you don't actually have to have this additional explicit cost that disciplines the recommendations. Okay.
Yes, I
So
think that
instead of that, you're getting the discipline of the search.
I'm sorry?
In some sense, what you're, we're getting rid of that, but instead we're having this verification by the consumers that they actually search stuff out.
Exactly. And that's what we think is important to understand, the way that social media influencers in particular, the effect that they're having, and what distinguishes them from maybe the financial or health advisors, is that when they're providing advice, the types of products they give advice for can be independently verified. Exactly.
Paul, can I ask something as well?
Oh, please.
I have two questions. One is, so basically, what if you would have asymmetric firms then? So what if I know as an influencer that one has a very large base anyway, so that it's a more attractive, basically, you know, could your result be overturned by the fact that I know that I'm going to sell, by recommending Coke to a lot of consumers, I know that I'm going to sell, you know, I'm going to earn a lot of commission because it's already simply, it has a larger fan base in some sense.
Okay, so to respond to that one, I would say no, because the influencers, they have already their own follower base. Right? So what they do is they cultivate their own brand, really. So like the
yes, but so then, but that would be simply having asymmetric firms, let's say. So some sort of that would, like, let's say.
So let's try different asymmetry. So maybe asymmetric costs or something like that. Is that?
Or V's, let's say, even, yeah, if you want.
V's, well, then it would still be better to recommend the. So if more people like Coke, then you would want to recommend that still, right?
Yeah,
so
okay.
So that would still be actually in the best interest of your follower base. They'll want to do what's best for their particular followers.
Yeah, that's probably true, actually, on average.
Yeah.
And the second thing, but so what if?
What I understood from Eva is that what might be best for the followers is telling them something that they don't already know. So, you know, as an influencer, I might add most value by giving you information that you don't already have. So telling you, you know, MIT is a great place to study economics as an advisor, well, that's fine. It's not going to be particularly helpful to you. You know, that would be a good place to get a job. If I tell that to my PhD student, I'm not telling them anything. But if I tell them, look, if you're interested in search and there's a fantastic community in Vienna, hopefully that's not telling them information either. But, you know, it might be
in principle, it could
saying MIT is a good place to do economics.
Yes. Okay, so let me deal with that. So I think to approach that question, I'd want to then expand the model to where there are maybe multiple industries, right? But I think you would see that enter into the commissions that the firms are willing to pay then. If they would not be willing to pay a high commission if they're already going to receive these followers. So I think that would be why it wouldn't reduce the result.
I think as we move to general questions, may I also ask one?
Okay, sure.
So it seems that in your model, the result is that because of this affiliation effect, the firm which is recommended by the influencer essentially charges higher price. But that's partially hinges on the fact that you kind of have whole traffic of consumers being directed via the influencer. Mm-hmm. And in reality, you can come as a general consumer without kind of knowing whether probably your kind of match value is affiliated with the influencer because you share common interests and you follow that person one way or another. But if it's a general consumer, you would probably expect the firm to charge average price for that consumer, so like any other generic firms. And that's maybe the reason why most of the influencers, at least in my experience, they give you some code. And if you come from that influencer and order from a firm using that code, actually the price is going to be lower than generic price, opposite to the higher price which you find in your model.
Right. So
A code? What is that?
Well, for example, I don't know. I know it's a lot about sports products. You don't know. I don't want to buy wrist straps or lifting belts. And there is some, I don't know, champion who has a blog on YouTube, and he says, well, I recommend this one. And by the way, if you put that code that you came from me,
right.
so that's how this person gets kickback. They will give you a discount of 10, 20%.
Right. But if you felt like his preferences were completely uninformative for you, or his recommendation was uninformative, so there was no
I follow that
affiliation
person for whatever reason. Yes. So that's
right. So, but if there are followers who have completely independent preferences to that of the influencer, then they'd have no particular reason to follow the recommendation, aside from maybe this promo code effect. You're right. If they get some discount for that, right? But,
no, but
if
even if I have affiliation, so I usually face, when I come via the influencer, I usually face lower price compared to the way if I come as a generic consumer. And if the price was higher, I could always kind of pretend to be a generic consumer and come from nowhere. And firms, they don't sell all their products through one single influencer. Yeah, so there are like many generic, quite a lot of generic traffic coming through. So I'm kind of trying to challenge this conclusion that the price necessarily going to be higher for the firm which won this contest for the influencer's recommendation.
I think what you are saying is that in this model, everybody is a follower of the influencer.
Of one single influencer, yes.
Exactly. And what you are talking about is that some people are followers of the influencer and some are not, and there is price discrimination going on. Yeah,
there is price discrimination, but the price discrimination, yes, essentially goes the other way.
Yeah, exactly.
By coming via the influencer, you usually get lower price.
Right, I think that's a good point. And so you're right, even if I were to expand the model now to include both followers and non-followers, it would still predict that there would be a higher price following the recommendation. But you're right, we might want to examine the effect of price discrimination through the promo codes.
I think there's a kind of this, you surely know the paper, the Spain for Prominence. And if I remember correctly, there was this section where you can influence the order by setting up prices. I read this quite a while ago. So probably here as well, you kind of can afford offering smaller or larger discounts for consumers coming via the influencer, and that affects whether the influencer will choose you or not, because if you offer large discounts, there will be large traffic, the influencer gets large kickbacks.
Right. Okay, so yes, I see what you're saying. So we do actually have other work that is going to enter into a different paper that deals exactly with promo codes. And so we do have a way of thinking about how the firms use the promo codes, and that is, and so we have a competing explanation for that one. But you're right, in terms of if you think that in the real world, firms that are recommended do not charge a higher price than other firms, that's the proper comparison, not the price discrimination. Okay, yeah, so I think that's the right response, is that what we're saying is that firms who are recommended charge a higher price than firms who are not recommended. And so it's not necessarily price discrimination to individual consumers.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I said that well, but does that make sense, or?
Yeah, it makes some sense. Yeah, but I kind of, my point was that probably like things going opposite ways here, and somehow they interact.
Okay, yeah, I
don't
know.
You look from one angle, but
right, but you're talking about
fine.
price. You're talking about price discrimination. What we're saying is we're comparing different firms altogether. We're not talking about the prices that would be charged to individual consumer bases. We're talking about individual firms. So we're saying that if you are recommended, you would just lift up your price.
Yes, but that's provided that you know that you are recommended to all consumers, but there might be consumers for which you are not recommended.
Right, but
you charge higher price and consumers walk away because of that, because they don't expect the match value. But you don't match. No, maybe you're right.
You would still okay, yeah. But I'll post more thought into that. Thank you. And I think I'm out of time, right? Is that correct? Or how much more time do I have left?
I mean, we've been asking questions throughout, so if you want to conclude for a minute or two.
I want to give my last result, if that's okay. All right. So
yeah.
Because I think this is let me just press on to the last result. Okay, so endogenizing the influencer search. All right, so far we've abstracted from the effort that the influencer would have to put forth to learn his own match value with the product. And this is different than just asking whether or not, given some set of match values, would the influencer want to be truthful in his recommendation, or asking, would he actually put forth the effort to inspect the products to figure out which one he actually does like the best. All right, so now we're going to suppose that the influencer has a search cost to examine products. And for the talk, we're going to assume that the firms just offer a constant rate of commission. So the timing for this setup now is that nature determines match values. Then the influencer is going to sequentially inspect firms, where upon inspection, a firm offers the influencer a contract. The influencer sees the contract and his own match value with the firm, and then decides whether or not to accept the contract and recommend the product or to continue searching. Right. So then once he finds a contract that he's willing to accept, firms observe that the recommendation has been made, check their prices, and the recommended firm can choose whether or not, again, the influencer discloses the price. And then the model proceeds as standard. Consumers observe the recommendation and then begin their search. So this setup becomes surprisingly technical, actually. And I won't go into all the details, but so we also assume that there's going to be, we're only interested in symmetric equilibria and with passive beliefs. And yeah, so it becomes surprisingly technical, but still the influencer, given a conjectured distribution of contracts and the distribution of match values he would have with different firms, he's going to ascribe to each firm a reservation value, and his optimal search will follow Pandora's rule, just like a typical search problem. And so what we find is that as long as the influencer's search cost is not too large, there exists an equilibrium in which consumers follow the recommendation, firms offer a positive commission, the influencer sequentially examines products and stopping and recommending a product only if his match value is sufficiently high. And the basic intuition is that as long as the influencer's match value is not too large, but still positive, it's important that it's still positive, then a firm is willing to offer a positive commission. Because if there's some chance the influencer will not accept the offer, that's how it becomes informative to the consumers, right? And as long as the firm doesn't have to pay too much to get the recommendation, it'll still be profitable to the firm. But then for a small enough search cost, when the influencer examines firms, it'll be best for him to accept a contract when the expected sales for a firm are high enough, right? And if you're interested, I could discuss why this becomes technically quite involved. But this is the basic intuition, though, that both parties would benefit from having this contract. So, and I already touched upon this, do we need regulation? And the main punchline here is that the regulators, if they're concerned with kickbacks or commissions, they need to assess whether the advice is immediately executed upon or if it actually serves to direct search. So with that, I'll list the outline of the paper and I'll elicit more of your questions if you have any. Thank you.
So I have a quick question. What if the costs are different? So you started talking about it. It looks like then maybe the result doesn't hold, right?
Okay, you're just asking what if the firms have different costs, right?
Production costs, right?
Production costs, exactly. So if we think that it would still be on average, you could still provide informative recommendations. If let's say that there's firms, they draw some random marginal cost from a distribution. As long as it's not correlated with the quality of the product, which we wouldn't expect to be correlated here, you could still have on average, there's an informative recommendation.
I mean, informative being like the best.
Right, so that you know that there's still some threshold so that the influencer would only still give the recommendation if his value is high enough, right?
Yeah, but if the cost is lower, then the low cost firm
Mhm.
would be able to offer a higher or a better incentive scheme for the influencer, right?
Right. But if
And
we, okay, let's place it into the search framework here though. So still, if the influencer has some conjecture about what contracts are being offered in the market, he goes to one seller. As long as there is some chance that he would reject the offer, it's still informative, right? As long as you have it so that there's some sufficiently low match value that he could have to where he would never want to accept the offer.
Mhm. I have to think about it. but-
Right. Yeah. I think the result is pretty robust though. The issue would arise if you had some negative correlation between, so you have firms with lower costs having products that are just going to be disliked more by the influencer.
Yes, that's the case I'm worried about.
Oh, that's the case you're worried about. In that case, I
Right.
would have to think more about it. But yeah, if they're not correlated, then I don't think it would have an effect. So yeah, if you think that would be an issue, then I guess I would just say that in those markets where that could be true, we wouldn't see, the model would predict that we wouldn't see influencers putting forth the effort to get the information because the consumers would just not follow the recommendation altogether.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I
Any
had
more
a
questions?
question about the competition between firms that are seeking recommendations. So you're assuming that all of the competition here is between firms that are offering different commissions, correct?
For the last result, yeah, we assume that they have commissions. Yeah, exactly.
So in reality, we often see non-commission based payments. So influencer on Twitch or YouTube advertising a video game will get paid per view without necessarily having an affiliate link. And I'm wondering if the value of prominence is sufficiently high that a lower quality firm might be willing to pay to get a recommendation to, I'm not necessarily thinking this would be an equilibrium, but I'm thinking it might break the equilibrium you have now if they were to offer a lump sum payment to get a recommendation.
Okay, so you're saying, what if we had, okay, so if you had lump sum payments in addition, okay, so real quick, so if we had general contracts that allowed commissions and lump sum payments, then as long as you have it, then that wouldn't be a problem if you had both in play. But you're saying, what if there was some firm who then was known to be a low quality? Is that what you're saying? And then they just offer a lump sum?
Well, so what I'm envisioning is you have a high quality firm that's bidding a high commission, and then a low quality firm bids a lump sum that might give a higher value to the influencer.
Okay, so one quick thing. This would be departing from our framework because we are considering horizontal differentiation, right? And where the firms don't know the match value that the influencer is going to have with them.
Okay.
Right, so that's one difference. And so what you're suggesting then is, what if instead we have more vertical differentiation, where you have higher and lower quality firms? So then you might see different contracts being offered there, right? So then I think it would be important in equilibrium to still have there be, you can think of some exotic equilibria where an influencer, they sometimes just give a recommendation for a bad quality product because they're getting paid more, but it still needs to be that on average, there's something informative about their recommendation, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so yeah, I was not worried so much about the equilibrium as whether it would break the equilibrium you have. If that difference makes sense.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a good point. I think we'll examine what happens in the vertical differentiation case too. That'd be worth examining. Yeah, thank you.
And then I know there was an earlier comment talking about comparing this model to Google. And I don't know whether your baseline model would work so well for that, but there is a fairly similar paper, my job market paper, that is looking at Amazon and other online market platforms that has a very similar flavor to this, at least in the baseline model. So you could expand the interpretation of this paper, at least in the baseline model, that way as well.
Okay, I'd be interested in talking with you more about that, hearing more about that. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Anyway, a very interesting talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions?
So circling back to the earlier kind of concern I have, most of the real life examples that I think of influencers, the influence is either providing something you couldn't find prior to owning the product, or often involves some deception that at least stays past the point of sale. And the one example I'd use is Firefest, literally the single most prominent example of social media influencers, where people did not realize that the music festival they were going to was very low quality until they got off their planes. I think your results are quite interesting, but I think for some products like video games, where there's some additional thing being provided beyond what you could see going to their website, I would worry that your results are missing part of the possible harm that an influencer could have.
Okay, I think in response to that, I would say that whatever markets that you think are would traditionally match the search, could be modeled as a search market. I think as long as the influencer is giving some recommendation for something in that market, then it's relevant for us. I think if you have some other product that shouldn't be modeled by a search market, then yeah, we wouldn't want to apply the model there.
I'll counter that though, because I think when you think about a search market, the value when you make your purchase doesn't actually need to be your real value. It needs to be your perceived value at that point in the search, in your process, right? Whether your match value is really your match value, or it's just the thing you believe when you make your purchase, is kind of semantics in a search market.
Well, I think that would be fine here though, right? You could have just some other noise. You could have some noise in your perceived match value here. Yeah, that's fine.
But what I'm saying is if it's providing a good signal, but not a perfect signal of your actual value you get when you purchase it.
Yeah,
in a normal search model, that wouldn't be a problem because there's no additional signal, but you're providing an additional signal that might affect this, right? Like I think the normal search argument is kind of having a problem here is more what I'd worry.
Okay, my intuition is to disagree strongly, but maybe I'm just misunderstanding you, okay? So maybe it'd be fun to talk about this afterwards, but the way I see it is, you're suggesting that when a consumer goes to a product, it could be that they don't accurately see exactly what their match value is. They have some signal of it, and then it's realized after they consume the product, right? And what I'm saying is, okay, what would be different here is when they arrive at the product, they get their personal signal from seeing the product, and they already have another signal from the influencer. I don't see that as being a problem for our model though.
So I'm not actually saying that it's a problem, but I'm more saying that if, for example, the influencer has seen two signals, the signal from the surface and then the signal from owning the product, if that second part of the signal is providing some additional information, I'm just saying most of the time I think of an influencer, they're using the product. They're doing something with this product that you could not do without owning.
Oh, okay. So you're suggesting that maybe we should model them as having an asymmetric distribution, like so they're not identical with the consumers. That's perfectly fine. Actually, in our model.
And I think it would make it, I don't think this would knock anything down. I more actually think it might.
Oh, okay. So I think what I should mention though is in our model, we assume that the consumers themselves are symmetric, but the influencer need not be symmetric. It only be affiliated. So the influencer could have more expertise, right? And so it could have a stronger signal from search than the consumers. So that's already included in the model. And so I think it also allows for the interpretation that you're suggesting.
Yeah, but it still comes down to, you're assuming that by investigation, a non-expert can figure out what that expert figured out by owning them. I think there is some aspect that you might even believe that they know more about you than you would know by going to Amazon, is kind of my worry here, right? Like I can look at a laptop on Amazon, But if an expert on technology explained to me why the screen's so great and how it's going to behave, and then ran a bunch of tests on the laptop that I wouldn't have seen otherwise, I've now got a lot more information about this laptop than I would have by paying a simple search cost and going to Amazon. I don't think this is a problem for all markets. I just think that for things like Let's Plays, where somebody explains the game in in-depth detail, or tech, I would worry that there is more going on, because you really are going to somebody with an expert opinion that can reveal information that would not be revealed by just looking at a website.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
So I guess what we would say is that, that's more information, but as long as it's possible that when you go to Amazon, you could look more into it and get some more information. As long as that's in principle possible, this holds. But you're right. If it becomes now more like the Credence Good market, once it becomes like that, then of course, then our model wouldn't be the best application to that. I think you're right. I think that's exactly what our results are suggesting. The more if it's like a Credence Good market, then you would need there to be some other cost to fibbing, right, to providing a bad recommendation. Whereas otherwise, if there's some search element to it, then not. And it just needs to be some search element. You're right. It could be that it's still stronger information from the influencer himself.
Yeah, I think even if you almost get a signal of deception, then there would still be some version of kind of keeping honesty here. I honestly don't know, but you're removing one of the normal channels of harm is, I think, what's worrying me.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to stop the recording here, but anyone else who has any additional questions can.
All right, thank you very much, everybody.